Cuba is a nation that has been the centre of history on many occasions, from American control to events such as the 10 Years' War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, before all of this, Cuba was in fact part of the Spanish Empire. After the arrival of Christopher Columbus to Cuba in 1492, Cuba became a Spanish colony. This documentary will cover the end of this Spanish rule over Cuba, analysing the causes of change in Cuban view on Spanish rule throughout the 19th century, resulting in Spain eventually relinquishing control over Cuba. 4 categories: nationalism, race relations, socio-economic and political or ideological views. At the beginning of the 19th century, Cuba's sugar and coffee production levels rose an astronomical amount, for many reasons. This created a new wealthy class of proprietors who based their wealth on the cultivation of sugar, coffee and tobacco. This new class were a class of plantocracy, were willing to obey political reforms as long as they had the protection of a foreign power from slave uprisings. This therefore affected the nationalism of the Cuban people towards Spain. Also, from a socio-economic perspective, many Cuban peninsulars grew more wealthy from this increase in the sugar industry. Throughout the 1820s, however, race relations grew more tense as great powers such as Britain began suppressing slave trade, making it increasingly difficult for this plantocracy to flourish, as they relied upon the work of slaves. This suppression of slavery, combined with the success of slave rebellions in other countries, slave rebellions in Cuba increased dramatically throughout the 1820s, greatly affecting industry in Cuba. Also, the Bourbon reforms in Spain greatly accelerated social, economic and political changes in Cuba. This led to population increase, expansion of agriculture, as well as the increase in profits in Cuba. This led to the creation of a new Creole class, dependent on the production and slave trade in Cuba. This new class of confident, successful citizens in Cuba were encouraged to begin considering different ways of reform by the Enlightenment period in Europe, where there was an increase in individual thinking and a decrease in tradition. This made reform in Cuba become increasingly likely and favoured in the community. This increasingly common way of thinking and flourishment of the Creole class made the 1800s become known as the Golden Century for Cuba, impacting anti-Spanish sentiment and encouraging the idea of reform in Cuba, as Spanish political and economic policies were beginning to be questioned and criticised by the birth of this new intellectual class. These economic and political policies, including increase in taxes and a lack of Creole representation in the government, turned Creole opinion away from reform and aimed towards independence. This led to the formation of a reformist party, comprising of the Creole class in 1865. They fought for political autonomy in Cuba, representation in the Cortes, equal rights in Cuba, limitation of Spanish control and the abolition of slavery on the island. This led to the formation of a rival party, the Unconditional Spanish Party, comprised of a group of peninsulars aimed to prevent this reform in Cuba. This led to political and economic instability in Spain and Cuba, resulting in Spain adopting a more moderate policy towards Cuban control. Therefore, a reform commission was to be elected, resulting in the election of 12 Creole reformist seats and 4 to peninsulars loyal to the crown, proving the desire for reform change in Cuba, not necessarily independence. However, despite this clear desire for reform in Cuba, Spain did not consider the recommendations and work of the Reform Commission, resulting in a push to keep slavery in Cuba, meaning there were limited opportunities for the Cuban labour force. Also, this led to an increase in slave rebellions throughout the century, increasing tension in Cuba. Eventually, the new Spanish government disbanded the Reform Commission as well as introducing new increased taxes, greatly angering the Cuban society. Finally, a new Captain General, Francisco Lersundi, was sent to Cuba, who greatly increased restrictions in Cuba, banning public meetings and censoring reformist literature. This was the last straw for the Creoles and Cubans, resulting in a new increased desire for independence, leading eventually to the 10 Years' War, which would eventually bring about the separation of Spain and Cuba.